Carl Jung's profound insight into human psychology centers on a revolutionary idea that contradicts much of what society teaches us about becoming our best selves. While the world encourages us to cultivate only our positive qualities, to present a polished version of ourselves to others, and to suppress or deny the parts of ourselves we find shameful or unacceptable, Jung insisted that this approach leads not to wholeness, but to fragmentation. He believed that every human being carries within them what he called the shadow, a repository of all the qualities, impulses, desires, and aspects of ourselves that we have rejected, repressed, or refused to acknowledge. This shadow is not merely a collection of evil or negative traits, though it certainly contains elements we might consider dark or destructive. Rather, it encompasses everything about ourselves that we have deemed unacceptable based on the values we absorbed from our families, our cultures, our religions, and our societies as we grew up. The shadow holds our rage, our selfishness, our sexual desires that don't fit neatly into approved categories, our envy, our capacity for cruelty, our laziness, our neediness, our aggression, and our primitive instincts. But Jung discovered something remarkable in his decades of work with patients and in his own courageous self-exploration. The shadow also contains tremendous creative energy, authentic desire, instinctual wisdom, and aspects of our personality that are not negative at all but have simply been rejected because they didn't fit the image we needed to project to survive in our particular environment. Jung's conviction that we must face our darkness to find our purpose emerged from both his clinical observations and his own harrowing personal journey into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. After his painful break with Sigmund Freud in 1913, Jung entered a period of intense psychological turmoil that lasted several years. He experienced vivid fantasies, disturbing visions, and encounters with figures from his unconscious that threatened to overwhelm him. Rather than dismissing these experiences as pathological or trying to suppress them, Jung made the courageous decision to engage with them directly. He recorded his visions in what would later be published as the Red Book, a massive illuminated manuscript that documented his descent into his own psychological underworld. During this period, Jung encountered aspects of himself that terrified and repulsed him. He faced his own capacity for grandiosity, his hunger for power, his aggressive impulses, and his potential for destruction. He engaged in what he called active imagination, dialoguing with the various figures that emerged from his unconscious, including a wise old man he named Philemon and a feminine figure he called Anima. Through this process, Jung didn't just theorize about the unconscious, he lived the reality of psychological transformation through direct encounter with his own rejected and unknown parts. What Jung discovered through this ordeal was that the aspects of ourselves we most vigorously deny or repress don't simply disappear. Instead, they continue to operate autonomously in the unconscious, influencing our behavior in ways we don't understand and can't control. When we refuse to acknowledge our shadow, it doesn't make us more virtuous or more evolved. Instead, it makes us unconscious. We become prone to projecting our disowned qualities onto others, seeing in them the very traits we cannot admit in ourselves. The person who prides themselves on their rationality and emotional control may be unconsciously drawn to dramatic, emotionally volatile partners, not recognizing their own repressed emotional nature, seeking expression through another. The individual who has constructed an identity around being good, moral, and selfless may find themselves obsessively critical of others they perceive as selfish, never recognizing their own denied self-interest operating beneath their conscious awareness. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his patients and in the world around him. He watched as individuals and entire nations acted out their collective shadows with devastating consequences, all while maintaining the conviction that they were acting righteously. The connection between facing our darkness and finding our purpose runs deeper than simply becoming more self-aware or psychologically healthy, though these are certainly important outcomes of shadow work. Jung believed that each person comes into this world with what he called their unique teleology, a kind of inner purpose or direction that seeks to unfold across the lifespan. He called this process individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are, rather than who your family, society, or ego ideal says you should be. But here is the crucial insight. You cannot become who you truly are while large portions of yourself remain unconscious and rejected. The energy that is bound up in maintaining our repressions, in keeping the shadow content locked away, is energy that cannot be used for creative self-expression and the fulfillment of our deeper purpose. Moreover, our true purpose is never found solely in our conscious ego's ambitions and plans. Often, the very thing we are meant to contribute to the world is connected to the qualities or experiences we have most tried to deny or escape. Consider the person who grows up in a family that values intellectual achievement above all else, who learns to suppress their emotional sensitivity and artistic inclinations because these qualities are dismissed as impractical or weak. This person may dutifully pursue a career that satisfies their family's expectations, achieving external success while feeling an increasing sense of emptiness and disconnection from any sense of meaning. Their shadow contains not just their rejected emotionality and creativity, but the very gifts they are meant to bring into the world. Until they can turn toward these denied aspects of themselves, face them, and integrate them into their conscious life, they will remain cut off from their genuine purpose. The shadow, in this case, holds not their darkness, but their light, the radiance of their authentic nature that has been forced underground. Jung noticed this pattern repeatedly. What we most need to become whole is often precisely what we have most strenuously rejected about ourselves. The process of facing our darkness is not a comfortable or easy undertaking. Jung never promised that the path of individuation would be pleasant. He understood that encountering our shadow requires tremendous courage because it means dismantling the carefully constructed image we have built of ourselves. It means admitting that we are capable of the very things we have condemned in others. It means acknowledging desires and impulses that contradict our moral self-concept. For someone who has built their identity around being strong and independent, facing their shadow might mean acknowledging their profound neediness and dependency. For someone who prides themselves on their compassion and kindness, it might mean confronting their capacity for coldness and cruelty. These recognitions don't come without psychological pain. Jung spoke of the process of individuation as a kind of death and rebirth. The ego must die to its inflated self-image, must undergo a crucifixion of its pretensions before a more genuine self can emerge. Yet Jung also recognized that this confrontation with darkness is not the same as acting out our shadow impulses. This is a crucial distinction that is often misunderstood in popular interpretations of Jung's work. Facing your shadow doesn't mean giving free rein to your destructive tendencies or using psychological insight as an excuse for harmful behavior. Rather, it means bringing unconscious content into consciousness, where it can be examined, understood, and ultimately integrated in a way that serves our growth rather than our destruction. Jung distinguished between being possessed by the shadow, where unconscious content overwhelms the ego and takes control of behavior, and integrating the shadow, where the ego consciously relates to previously unconscious material while maintaining ethical responsibility. Integration means acknowledging, for instance, that you have aggressive impulses while choosing not to harm others. It means recognizing your capacity for selfishness while still acting with consideration for others. The energy that was bound up in repression becomes available for conscious choice and creative expression. The relationship between shadow and purpose becomes clearer when we understand Jung's conception of the self, which he distinguished from the ego. The ego is our conscious sense of identity, the I that we experience as ourselves in daily life. But Jung recognized that the ego is just a small portion of the total psyche. Beneath and surrounding the ego is the vast realm of the unconscious, both personal and collective. And at the center of the total psyche, encompassing both conscious and unconscious, Jung posited the self, the archetype of wholeness and the organizing principle of the entire personality. The self represents who we truly are in our totality, while the ego represents only our conscious knowledge of ourselves. Our genuine purpose, according to Jung, comes from the self, not from the ego's ambitions and plans. The self speaks to us through dreams, through synchronicities, through symptoms and problems that won't resolve, through our attractions and repulsions, and especially through the shadow. When we ignore or reject shadow material, we are actually rejecting communication from the self, rejecting information about our wholeness that is trying to reach consciousness. Jung observed that many people reach a point in midlife where the life they have built, often quite successfully by external standards, suddenly feels hollow and meaningless. He called this the midlife crisis, but he understood it not as a pathology, but as a crucial developmental challenge. What happens at this stage is that the self begins to press more insistently for recognition, and the gap between the life the ego has constructed and the life the self is calling toward becomes unbearable. People who have lived according to collective values, who have pursued success, status, relationships, and achievements that society deems important, find that these accomplishments no longer satisfy. The question arises with increasing urgency: who am I really, and what is my life actually for? This question cannot be answered by the ego alone because the ego doesn't know. The answer lies in the unconscious, in the parts of ourselves we haven't yet met, particularly in the shadow. The person must now turn inward and begin the process of encountering what has been rejected and denied. This is often when people enter therapy or analysis, when they begin exploring practices like dream work, active imagination, or creative expression that can help them access unconscious content. The courage to face our darkness is also connected to what Jung called the problem of opposites. He recognized that the psyche contains inherent polarities, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, good and evil, light and dark, order and chaos. The immature ego tries to identify completely with one pole while rejecting the other. We want to see ourselves as entirely good, entirely rational, entirely civilized, but Jung insisted that psychological health and genuine individuation require holding the tension of opposites, acknowledging that we contain both poles of these fundamental human dualities. We are both good and evil, both rational and irrational, both civilized and primitive. The refusal to acknowledge one side of these polarities creates a split in the psyche that prevents us from accessing our full humanity and our deepest purpose. Jung believed that the ability to hold opposites in consciousness without splitting them apart is a mark of psychological maturity and spiritual development. This capacity emerges directly from shadow work because the shadow contains precisely those opposite qualities the ego has rejected. Jung's own life exemplified this principle in profound ways. He was a man who held together remarkable opposites within himself. He was both a rigorous scientist trained in medicine and psychiatry, and a mystic who took seriously visions, synchronicities, and the reality of the spiritual dimension. He was both deeply rooted in his Swiss cultural context and able to appreciate the wisdom of Eastern religions, alchemy, and Gnostic Christianity that stood outside the Western mainstream. He was both a respectable family man and professional, and someone who maintained an unconventional relationship with two women, his wife Emma and his longtime companion Tony Wolfe. While his personal life is legitimately subject to ethical critique, particularly regarding his treatment of the women in his life, Jung's work demonstrates his effort to live with psychological honesty about his actual complexity, rather than forcing himself into a conventionally acceptable persona. His willingness to acknowledge his own darkness, his own capacity for what might be judged as moral failure, informed his compassionate understanding of human psychology, and his insistence that we must embrace our wholeness rather than our perfection. The process of discovering purpose through shadow work often involves recognizing that our wounds and our gifts are intimately connected. Jung recognized that psychological symptoms, problems that won't resolve, recurring patterns that cause suffering, are not just obstacles to overcome, but messages from the unconscious trying to redirect us toward our authentic path. The addiction that brings someone to their knees might ultimately connect them to a purpose of helping others face similar struggles. The depression that forces someone to withdraw from a high-achieving but inauthentic life might create the space for discovering work that actually matters to them. The relationship patterns that keep failing might be pushing someone to develop consciousness about unconscious family patterns that are running their life. Jung saw symptoms and suffering not as mere pathology, but as the psyche's way of getting our attention, of insisting that we cannot continue in the old direction, that something needs to change. Our darkness, our suffering, our shadow contains information about where we have gone off course and what needs to be brought back into our lives. This understanding has profound implications for how we approach personal development and the search for meaning. The popular self-help culture often encourages us to focus on our strengths, to visualize positive outcomes, to affirm our goodness and potential. While there may be value in these approaches, Jung would say they are dangerously incomplete without the corresponding work of facing our darkness. Focusing only on light creates more shadow. The brighter we insist on making our conscious personality, the darker and more dangerous the unconscious shadow becomes. Jung observed this in individuals who appeared spiritually developed or morally superior, but whose shadows erupted in scandals, destructive behaviors, or psychological breakdowns. He saw it in religious communities that preached love while secretly harboring abuse and corruption. He recognized it in nations that proclaimed their enlightened values while perpetrating atrocities. The refusal to acknowledge darkness doesn't eliminate it, but rather ensures it will manifest in more destructive and unconscious ways. True purpose, according to Jung, is never just about achieving success, gaining recognition, or even helping others in straightforward ways. It is about becoming whole, about integrating the rejected aspects of ourselves, and thereby becoming more fully human. This wholeness then allows us to contribute something authentic to the world, something that could only come from our unique constellation of experiences, gifts, wounds, and insights. The person who has done their shadow work brings a different quality to their actions in the world. They are less likely to project their unconscious content onto others. They are more capable of genuine relationships because they can see others as they actually are, rather than as receptacles for their projections. They are more creative because they have access to the raw material of the unconscious. They are more grounded and less susceptible to inflation and grandiosity because they have acknowledged their capacity for destructiveness and error. They are more compassionate because they recognize in themselves the full range of human possibility, both magnificent and terrible. Jung also recognized that facing our darkness requires us to challenge the moralistic judgments we have internalized about what is acceptable and unacceptable in human nature. Much of what lives in our shadow is there not because it is genuinely destructive, but because it was deemed inappropriate by the particular value system we grew up in. A child raised in an emotionally repressed family may shadow their emotional expressiveness. A person raised in a religious environment that emphasized humility and self-sacrifice may shadow their ambition and healthy self-interest. Someone raised in a family that valued toughness may shadow their vulnerability and need for comfort. These shadowed qualities are not moral failures, but natural human characteristics that were rejected for circumstantial reasons. Reclaiming them doesn't make us bad people, but more complete people. Jung encouraged his patients to develop what he called a moral consciousness that went beyond conventional morality, a capacity to make ethical choices based on their own individual situation and relationship to the self, rather than simply following external rules. The encounter with the shadow also connects to Jung's understanding of archetypes, the universal patterns and images that structure human experience across all cultures and times. One of the most important archetypal encounters in the individuation process is the meeting with the shadow as a figure in dreams or active imagination. The shadow often appears as a same-sex figure who embodies qualities the dreamer rejects in themselves. For a man, it might appear as a threatening male figure, perhaps a criminal or a rival. For a woman, it might appear as a despised or dangerous female figure. The ego's first response to the shadow figure is usually fear, disgust, or hostility. But Jung taught that the attitude we must ultimately develop toward the shadow is not one of warfare, but of dialogue and integration. We must learn to ask the shadow figure what it wants, what it needs, what message it carries. Often the shadow figure is not simply destructive, but carries qualities the ego desperately needs. The shadow might bring vitality to an overly controlled personality, softness to someone who is too hard, boundaries to someone who is too accommodating, playfulness to someone who is too serious. As we go deeper into Jung's understanding of why we must face our darkness to find our purpose, we encounter his conviction that the confrontation with shadow is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process that continues throughout life. Each time we reach a new level of consciousness, a new depth of shadow material becomes available for integration. The work is never fully complete because the psyche is not a static structure, but a living, evolving system. What Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to generate new symbols and create bridges between conscious and unconscious, continues to produce material for consciousness to assimilate. This means that the discovery of purpose is not a destination we reach, but a continual unfolding, a process of becoming that lasts as long as we live. Each layer of shadow work opens new possibilities for how we might contribute to the world and express our unique nature. The person at 30 who discovers their purpose through initial shadow work will find that purpose deepening and transforming as they continue the work at 40, 50, 60, and beyond. Jung's concept of the wounded healer captures another dimension of how darkness relates to purpose. He recognized that those who do deep psychological work, who face their own wounds and shadows, develop a capacity to help others that cannot be acquired through intellectual learning alone. The therapist, counselor, mentor, or guide who has descended into their own psychological depths and returned, bring something invaluable to their work with others. They bring genuine empathy rather than theoretical sympathy. They bring the knowledge that comes from lived experience of psychological suffering and transformation. They bring humility because they know their own capacity for being lost, for making mistakes, for falling into unconsciousness. Jung himself embodied this principle. His willingness to share his own psychological struggles, his own confrontation with the unconscious, gave his work an authenticity and depth that purely academic psychology could not match. He understood that the healer must be wounded, that the guide must have been lost, that the person who would help others find their way must have first faced their own darkness. The relationship between shadow work and creativity is another crucial aspect of Jung's understanding of purpose. He recognized that authentic creative work emerges from the unconscious, from depths of the psyche that lie beyond ego control. Artists, writers, musicians, and creators of all kinds who do their best work are those who can access this unconscious material and give it form. But to access the creative depths of the unconscious requires a relationship with the shadow, because the shadow is the doorway to the deeper layers of the psyche. The person who maintains rigid control over their personality, who refuses to acknowledge anything that might challenge their self-image, cannot access the raw, vital, sometimes disturbing material that great creative work requires. Jung observed that many of his most creative patients were those who had suffered psychological crises that broke through their ego defenses and forced them into relationships with unconscious content. The breakdown, properly navigated, became a breakthrough into creative possibility. This doesn't mean we should seek crisis or suffering, but it does mean we should recognize that our difficulties, our darkness, our encounters with the shadow, contain creative potential that can be harvested if we approach them with the right attitude. Jung also understood that the collective shadow, the disowned aspects of entire groups, cultures, and nations, plays a crucial role in historical events and social problems. Just as individuals project their personal shadows onto others, groups project their collective shadows, often with catastrophic results. Jung lived through 2 world wars and witnessed the rise of fascism in Europe. He recognized these horrors as eruptions of the collective shadow, the return of the repressed on a massive scale. When an entire culture identifies with being civilized, rational, and progressive, while denying its capacity for barbarity, irrationality, and regression, that denied content doesn't disappear but builds up pressure in the collective unconscious until it explodes. Jung's warnings about the collective shadow remain relevant today as we witness continued polarization, projection, and demonization of outgroups, while in-groups maintain the illusion of their own innocence and righteousness. The work of facing our individual shadows is not just personal development, but contributes to the larger project of reducing the destructive potential of the collective shadow. Each person who takes responsibility for their own darkness is one less person unconsciously acting out those contents in the world. The spiritual dimension of Jung's understanding of shadow work is essential to grasp. Although Jung was careful to distinguish his work from theology and to speak in psychological rather than religious terms, he was deeply concerned with what we might call the soul or the spiritual life of the individual. For Jung, the confrontation with darkness was ultimately a confrontation with the mystery of existence itself, with questions of meaning, mortality, good and evil, and the nature of the divine. He noted that many of the world's spiritual traditions include some version of the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual crisis, doubt, and dissent that precedes genuine awakening or transformation. The mystics spoke of dying to the false self, of descending into hell before ascending to heaven, of confronting demons before meeting God. Jung saw these metaphors as describing psychological realities, the necessary encounter with shadow material that precedes genuine spiritual development. He was critical of forms of spirituality that aimed only at transcendence, at rising above the darkness into light, because he recognized that this was another form of splitting, another refusal to embrace the fullness of existence. True spirituality, for Jung, included the descent as well as the ascent, the engagement with earth and body and instinct, as well as spirit and transcendence. One of the most challenging aspects of Jung's teaching about shadow work is his insistence that we must develop a relationship to what he called evil, not just as an external force, but as a potential within ourselves. This was particularly controversial in his later work, especially in his book Answer to Job, where he explored the problem of evil in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Jung recognized that the conventional Christian view, which locates evil entirely in the devil and sees God as entirely good, creates a split that has psychological consequences. If we imagine that we can be purely good, identified with God or spirit or light, while projecting all evil onto an external enemy, we remain unconscious of our own shadow and therefore dangerous. Jung argued that we must acknowledge what he called the dark side of God, the reality that the force that creates also destroys, that existence itself contains both creation and destruction, both good and evil. This doesn't mean embracing evil or acting destructively, but it means acknowledging evil as a reality within existence and within ourselves, which paradoxically gives us the possibility of making conscious ethical choices rather than simply acting out unconscious destructiveness while believing ourselves to be righteous. The practical work of facing our darkness involves several approaches that Jung developed and that have been elaborated by subsequent depth psychologists. Dream work is central because dreams are the primary way the unconscious communicates with consciousness, and the shadow frequently appears in dream imagery. Jung taught his patients to record their dreams, to work with dream symbols, and to take dreams seriously as messages from the unconscious about what needs attention. Active imagination, the practice of entering into a meditative state and dialoguing with figures that emerge from the unconscious, provides another avenue for encountering shadow material. Creative expression through art, writing, movement, or music can help give form to unconscious content and bring it into relationship with consciousness. Body-centered practices are also important because the shadow is not just mental but includes our rejected physicality, our instincts, our sexuality, and our animal nature. Therapy or analysis with someone trained in depth psychology provides a container and a relationship within which shadow work can safely occur. Because facing our darkness often requires the presence of another consciousness, who can help us maintain perspective and avoid being overwhelmed. Jung also emphasized the importance of what he called amplification, the practice of connecting personal psychological material to myths, fairy tales, religious symbols, and alchemical imagery from various cultures and historical periods. He recognized that the challenges we face individually are not unique to us, but are universal human experiences that have been depicted in symbolic form throughout history. When we can connect our personal shadow encounter to, for instance, the hero's descent into the underworld in mythology, or the alchemical process of nigredo or blackening that precedes transformation, or the fairy tale motif of the youngest child who must venture into the forest and face dangers before claiming their inheritance, we gain perspective and meaning. We recognize that what feels like our personal failure or darkness is actually part of a larger pattern of human transformation. This doesn't minimize our experience but contextualizes it within the larger story of human psychological and spiritual development. The role of projection in shadow work cannot be overstated. Jung recognized that we cannot see our shadow directly because by definition it is unconscious. Instead, we encounter it through projection onto others. The people who trigger our strongest negative reactions, who we find irritating, threatening, or contemptible, are often carrying projections of our own shadow content. Jung recommended that whenever we have a strong emotional reaction to someone, especially a disproportionate reaction, we should ask ourselves what quality in that person we might be rejecting in ourselves. This doesn't mean that everyone who bothers us is simply a mirror of our shadow, or that people don't have genuinely problematic qualities. But it does mean that the intensity of our reaction often indicates something about our own psyche. The person who is enraged by laziness in others likely has a complicated relationship with their own desires for rest and ease. The individual who is disgusted by emotional neediness in others probably has their own dependency needs in shadow. By working with our projections, by taking them back and asking what they reveal about ourselves, we gradually come to know our shadow and reduce its unconscious influence on our perceptions and relationships. Jung understood that finding our purpose through shadow work often requires us to sacrifice who we thought we were going to be in order to become who we actually are. This sacrifice can be profound and painful. The person who has invested decades in a career path that brought security and status but never felt authentic must face the terror of potentially starting over. The individual who has maintained relationships based on their persona rather than their true self must risk rejection by showing who they really are. The parent who has lived through their children's achievements must face their own unlived life. These sacrifices feel like death to the ego because in a sense they are death. The death of an identity, a life structure, a set of assumptions about who we are and what we're supposed to do. Yet Jung insisted that these deaths are necessary for the birth of genuine selfhood. He often cited the alchemical motto, solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, indicating that psychological transformation requires the dissolution of old forms before new forms can emerge. The shadow work dissolves the rigid structures of the ego, the fixed identity we have clung to, creating a kind of psychological chaos. But from this chaos, if we can bear it without fleeing back to familiar patterns, a new order emerges that is more aligned with the self and with our true purpose. The question of moral responsibility becomes complex but crucial in Jung's understanding of shadow integration. He was adamant that recognizing our capacity for evil, for destructiveness, for what we would judge as immoral, does not give us permission to act on those capacities. Integration is not the same as acting out. In fact, Jung believed that people who have integrated their shadows and who know their own darkness are less likely to act destructively than those who remain unconscious of their shadow, because the integrated person makes conscious choices rather than being driven by unconscious compulsions. The murderer who claims he was overwhelmed by an urge he couldn't control is someone possessed by his shadow, not someone who has integrated it. The integrated person acknowledges the aggressive or destructive impulses, feels them, understands them, but retains the capacity to choose not to act on them. This is an important distinction because Jung is sometimes misinterpreted as relativistic or as excusing harmful behavior through psychological explanation. His actual position was that consciousness increases responsibility rather than diminishing it. Once we know our shadow, we are more responsible for our choices, not less. Jung's understanding of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that cannot be explained by conventional causality, also relates to the question of shadow and purpose. He noticed that when people were engaged in deep psychological work, particularly shadow work, They often experienced synchronicities that seemed to guide them toward their path. A person struggling with whether to leave an unfulfilling career might have a chance encounter with someone who offers exactly the opportunity they need. Someone wrestling with a psychological complex might have a dream and then encounter the same symbol in waking life in a way that provides clarity. Jung understood these synchronicities as manifestations of the self, as evidence that the psyche is not confined to our individual skull, but participates in a larger field of meaning. When we do the work of integrating shadow material, we align ourselves more closely with the self, and this alignment seems to activate synchronicities that support our individuation process. Purpose reveals itself not just through internal psychological work, but through these meaningful encounters with the external world that point us in particular directions. The feminine principle and the anima archetype in Jung's psychology also connect to shadow work and purpose, particularly for men, though Jung's understanding has been expanded by subsequent thinkers to apply more broadly. Jung recognized that in a patriarchal culture that values rationality, control, achievement, and emotional restraint, qualities associated with the feminine such as receptivity, emotionality, intuition, and relatedness are often pushed into shadow, particularly for men. The encounter with the anima, the unconscious feminine in a man's psyche, is a crucial part of his individuation process and often involves recognizing and integrating these shadowed qualities. For women, Jung spoke of the animus, the unconscious masculine, though his understanding of feminine psychology was less developed and has been rightly critiqued and expanded by subsequent thinkers. The broader point remains valuable. We shadow qualities that our culture has gendered and that don't fit our conscious identity. Integrating these opposite-gendered qualities enriches our personality and opens new possibilities for how we engage with the world and express our purpose. The relationship between suffering and purpose in Jung's thought is paradoxical and profound. He did not celebrate suffering for its own sake or suggest that we should seek out pain. But he recognized that suffering often serves as the catalyst that forces us into psychological work we would otherwise avoid. When life is going smoothly and we are achieving our ego's goals, there is little motivation to question our direction or to face uncomfortable truths about ourselves. It is typically when something breaks, when we fail, when we lose something we valued, when we fall into depression or anxiety, when our relationships crumble, when our carefully constructed life reveals itself as hollow, that we are forced to turn inward and begin the difficult work of self-examination. Jung saw suffering as potentially meaningful, as the psyche's way of getting our attention and insisting that we cannot continue in our current direction. The suffering contains information about where we have gone wrong, about what we have neglected, about what needs to change. Our purpose often emerges directly from our wounds, from our suffering, from the places where we have been broken open. The person who has suffered depression and emerged from it with new understanding may find their purpose in helping others through similar darkness. The individual who has experienced the pain of a particular injustice may find their calling in working to prevent others from suffering the same way. Jung's later concept of the self as the God image within the psyche points to the ultimate dimension of his understanding of shadow and purpose. He came to see the individuation process, the journey of encountering and integrating the shadow and becoming whole, as equivalent to the religious quest, the search for connection with the divine. But Jung's understanding of the divine was not conventional. He recognized that the self, which represents our wholeness and our deepest nature, contains both light and dark, both creative and destructive elements, both what we call good and what we call evil. To connect with the self, to find our deepest purpose, requires accepting this totality. We cannot cherry-pick only the acceptable aspects of ourselves and claim to be in relationship with our deepest nature. Jung's controversial statement that the self requires the integration of evil, properly understood, means that we must acknowledge the dark aspects of existence and of our own nature as part of the totality of what we are. This is perhaps the most challenging dimension of his teaching, because it asks us to give up our identification with being good, with being on the right side, with being innocent. It asks us to embrace our complicity in the darkness of existence while still choosing to act ethically and with consciousness. The ultimate message of Jung's teaching about facing our darkness to find our purpose is both challenging and liberating. It is challenging because it means we cannot find our way through life simply by following external rules, by achieving the goals society sets for us, or by maintaining a positive self-image. It requires the courage to descend into uncertainty, to meet aspects of ourselves we would prefer not to know, to sit with the discomfort of recognizing our own capacity for what we judge as negative or destructive. It requires patience, because the process cannot be rushed or controlled by the ego's will. It requires humility, because it means acknowledging that we don't know ourselves as well as we think we do, and that we need the unconscious to teach us who we really are. But the teaching is also profoundly liberating, because it means that nothing about us is wasted. That even our darkest qualities and most painful experiences contain meaning and potential for growth. It means that we don't have to be perfect to have purpose, that our wounds and our flaws are not obstacles to our calling, but are intimately connected to it. It means that the very things we are most ashamed of, most afraid of in ourselves, may hold the key to what we are meant to contribute to the world. It means that purpose is not something we have to manufacture or achieve through effort, but something we discover by becoming more fully who we already are, including and especially the parts we have tried to deny. Jung's legacy is the invitation to this courageous journey inward, into the darkness that contains the seeds of our deepest light, into the shadow that holds the secret of our truest purpose, into the totality of ourselves, where we discover not perfection, but wholeness, not the absence of darkness, but the integration of light and dark into a meaningful life.